but it has been, stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch, or it's making crazy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of TRD Talks Live. I'm Eric Enquist, Senior Managing Editor at The Real Deal, and I am joined today by three of New York's business leaders. One is Andrew Kimball. He is the CEO of Industry City, a major industrial park in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And the second is Alan Fishman, Chairman of Ladder Capital. That is a real estate investment trust with more than $6 billion in assets. And he is also a longtime New York City business leader. And finally, we are going to be joined shortly by Kathy Wylde, who, as many of you know, is the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, which is the primary business organization in the city representing all of its largest companies. So welcome to everyone. Before we get started, I just want to remind all our viewers that we do bring you these webinars 3 times a week for free, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 o'clock. But for us to keep doing that, we need you to subscribe. So please go to therealdeal.com and subscribe so we can continue to bring you these presentations, which have been very popular mostly because everyone wants to talk about how we're going to get through this pandemic. And we're going to do quite a bit of that today. But first, I would like Alan and Andrew to tell us, and all our viewers, what exactly they do, because not everyone necessarily knows Ladder Capital, even though it's a huge company. And Industry City, you may not have ever been to it, but it's one of the most important business centers in the city as well. So Alan, let me start with you. Tell us a little bit about Ladder Capital, how long it's been around and where your assets are.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. First, let me say I hope you're all safe and coping reasonably well with this nightmare. I'd also want to say right up front that I'm not speaking specifically for Ladder, as we're a public company and with reporting requirements and limitations and all that. That said, Ladder's a commercial mortgage REIT, principally a commercial mortgage REIT. We founded it, interestingly enough, in 2008, out of the crisis, the financial crisis of 2008. We were the first real estate firm founded, basically, coming out of the crisis. And so we have had a view about conservatism and panic and all of those things. But since our founding, we are a mortgage lender. We make first mortgage loans around the country. We are a major investor in mortgage securities and real estate securities in general, commercial real estate securities in general, and we own quite a bit of property around the country. So we do a lot of things. We're involved in most property types, but not all property types. We can get into that as well. And as I said, we own a considerable amount of real estate. In addition, I serve on the board of a major major U.S. bank, and have a perspective.
Which bank is that?
From that Banco Santander in their U.S. operations, the big Spanish bank, and have a big have a perspective on the auto lending sector because of that, and generally on what a bank is also facing in this crisis as well.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I haven't even thought about cars recently because if you live in New York City, there just aren't that many around for a change. Andrew, tell us briefly about Industry City. It's an industrial campus, and it's you were brought on from the Brooklyn Navy Yard to basically rework the whole campus. How is that going?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's great to be here, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with Alan and Kathy. Alan and I were collaborators on the revitalization of the Brooklyn Navy Yard for about 8 years, and amongst the many things Alan does, and Kathy has always been, as a local South Brooklyn native, one of our biggest supporters along the Brooklyn waterfront with revitalization. So, unlike the Navy Yard, Industry City is 100% privately owned asset. It's 16 buildings on 35 acres, 6 million square feet of space, right off the BQE. And basically for 40, 50 years, it fell apart like the Navy Yard had since World War II. What was unique in 2013 was a new ownership group came along and hired me from the Navy Yard to try to bring it back to life, only with private investment, with lenders who are willing to take the chance on seeing it come back to life, really focused on the innovation economy, the broad range of making a physical, a digital, or an engineered product. And, we had some pretty tremendous success the last 7 years. We've gone from 150 businesses to 550, about 1,900 jobs to 7,000. That's about 100 jobs a month for 7 years. Mm-hmm. But obviously, things have stopped, and we're very anxious about the future. But one of the reasons I am glass half full, as dark as these days are, and as dark as they may be for a while, is people like Kathy and Alan, and all of us that played a role in the revitalization of Brooklyn are going to step right up again.
Yeah, I should mention that all four of us are Brooklynites. I'm happy to say, right? Alan Fishman is from Brooklyn Heights, and Kathy Wylde, who's just joining us, I think you live in Bay Ridge, am I correct?
Correct.
I'm in Park Slope. Where are you, Andrew?
Park Slope.
Excellent. So we got them outnumbered here, the Slopers. Kathy Wylde, the sort of president and CEO of Partnership for New York City. Kathy, just tell us very briefly, who's in the Partnership for New York City. And, when I think of the partnership, I think of big companies like, I think Rupert Murdoch was your chairman, right, for a few years. So you are really representing, some of the Fortune 500 companies that New York is known for, but who else is in your member?
Well, Alan Fishman's also a member. So it's a combination of global companies and entrepreneurial companies. It's a mixture, but the idea is to have the largest employers, the globally focused companies. When David Rockefeller started the partnership, after the crisis, the urban crisis in New York, near bankruptcy of the 1970s, the idea was that business should not be asleep at the switch when the city is going into a crisis, that business should be caring about the interests of the city. We're not a chamber of commerce. We're an organization that is absolutely committed to the future of New York City, which is obviously in jeopardy right now.
Well, it's a great segue, because if that's your raison d'etre, then this is exactly the time when you should be kicking into gear. So the city's been shut down for 7 weeks, and we don't know exactly how long that's going to continue, but a number of weeks more. There's talk about ramping up now, finally, in the middle of this month, perhaps. But from your organization's perspective, how serious is this, and what is the path forward as your members see it?
Well, it's very serious. I have to get rid of a cat. 1 second. No, it's a very serious situation. And I said the other day, it reminds me more of the 1970s than of 9/11 or the Great Recession, where we have where we've lost so much so fast. And that happened in the 70s. In about 5 years, we lost half our Fortune 500 companies. We lost 1 million people. And we lost the value, much of the value of the city. And we had to work 40 years to have that come back. And what we want to make sure now is that we learn from that experience. Number one was real unity among the various sectors of the city. Right. Business, labor, we all work together. So we're hoping that this time we'll get it right. We'll have a consensus around a plan, what we have to do to come back, and we'll be able to make the case to Washington to support us in that effort.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get to government in a minute here. Alan, I wondered if you could offer your perspective on how this compares to the fiscal crisis of the 70s. And what kind of trouble we are in at this point.
Well, I think Kathy's right. I think the difference this time is that this is a completely random shot. The companies that have been disadvantaged by this event are offset by companies that are advantaged, and there's just no way of knowing. What we know very little right now, to be blunt. Mm-hmm. I think we know a lot less than we don't. We know a lot less than we think we know. Mm-hmm. Very early days. What we know is, so far, from a real world perspective, it seems to me, is that the only winner here is technology. What you can report is that the cloud, mm-hmm. Witnessed this event today. Exactly. The cloud has worked, and that people can conduct affairs, business affairs and commercial affairs, governmental affairs, and so on, through the cloud. Now, what that means for real estate and for the city is very complex. And the fight between technology and work at home versus social distancing space in an office and what that all means, I think is just way early days to figure that all out. And the other comment I'd make is, unfortunately, New York is in a much, much different place than most of the rest of the country and most of the rest of the world.
A worse place, I'm sure you're going to tell us, right, at the moment.
Say again?
Worse, different in terms of...
I would argue much worse, but I don't even know that. I think much worse.
We represent, just to give you a number, we represent 30% of all the COVID cases, the coronavirus cases in the world, in the New York metro area, and we represent 50% of the deaths in the United States.
Right, and then there's also the matter of how the city functions, and we kind of rely on a way of functioning that puts us more at risk than some other places. Andrew, I'm sure you've been working from home just like the rest of us have, but your campus relies on people getting to the campus, right, and interacting at the campus. So are you shut down? I mean, what's the circumstance there? You're an industrial/retail campus.
Yeah, I'd say about 90% of our companies there, of the 550, were not essential businesses, right? So they couldn't come into work anymore. Some number of them have been doing fine, being able to work from home. Some number of them haven't been able to do anything and are facing some tough times. For those that have been able to be there, it's pretty extraordinary. And just to, again, cast a positive light. I mean, obviously, our first responders are heroes. There are a lot of people supporting them. And some of the manufacturers at the Navy Yard, some of them in Industry City, just the immediate pivot to drop everything they're doing, sew gowns, sew masks, do eye shields, now do food relief, meals to first responders and hospitals, and also now to food pantries, because we face a very serious issue. But
right.
You're right, that it's going to look very different as we start to think about coming back. Even though there will be a significantly larger number that have to work from home for a period of time, I also think that, and the experience when we're back at Industry City will be different for a period of time until we have treatments and hopefully a vaccine in terms of keeping people apart. But I also think that, the sort of core of what Industry City was about in terms of community and ecosystem, people are dying to have that again. And so we're going to have to manage that well as people come back.
Yeah, that's going to be a challenge. And speaking of challenges, Alan, obviously the mortgage market is very important to Ladder, the company you chair. What's happening in the mortgage market? How exposed are you and other people in your field to non-payment? And just give us the lay of the land, if you could.
Well, I think this falls into the category of what we don't know. What we do know is that March payments. Well, we do know in March, going into March, the real estate mortgage delinquency world had never seen a better sort of cleaner record. What we also know is that in April, for many lenders, ourselves included and the banks included and so on, other than consumer loans, basically loans have been paid on time largely. Consumer loans across the spectrum of loans, mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, and so on, have had very, very massive deferments, forbearance agreements, temporary relief, and so on.
Right. What are the ramifications of that?
Well, I think it depends really on whether this is a timeout or whether it is a permanent or semi-permanent affliction. If everybody gets back to work reasonably quickly around the country, then it's a timeout and things will go back to sort of normal in consumer land. Obviously, the government, Treasury, and the Federal Reserve have worked tirelessly on this. I will tell you that in my view, they've been very, very well functioning, but they see this as a huge problem and they've thrown the kitchen sink at it. And so I think May will tell us more in terms of mortgage payments, and June will tell us more yet. But going into May, we're holding our breath, and we'll see.
So it's not like there have been.
It's also true that the capital markets have calmed down quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the panic that existed has been addressed in most respects.
So you're not seeing margin calls. Your industry competitors you're not hearing talks of margin calls and the collapse of the CMBS market. Like that's.
Yeah, we saw all of that. We saw all of that and more, right? In late March and early April. We're not seeing that now. The Federal Reserve has done a pretty good job, and margin deposits are being returned to the borrowers and so on and so forth. It's not perfect by any means, and the market is still very dislocated, but the sort of panic phase is behind us, I think, for the most part. Now we're into the, oh my God, what do we got to do now phase? Right. And what's really going to happen? And that's, I think, what nobody has yet been able to focus on.
Right. And in terms of the government response, I know, obviously, when we talk fiscal help, we're talking federal, because the state is broke, the city's broke, we're worse than broke, actually. We're facing huge deficits now. I wonder if we could talk about, Kathy, what you see as government responsibilities. We can start briefly with the federal, as Alan mentioned, obviously there have been huge efforts with the stimulus package, or whatever you want to call it, relief aid. Has that been sufficient? Do we need to see more? What are your members telling you about that, Kathy Wylde?
Well, for the most part, our members are not involved with the stimulus package from the loan standpoint. The PPP was directed at smaller businesses under 500. Unfortunately, under 500 employees. Unfortunately, New York has not done well in the competition for those loans, and we're seeing places like Utah on a per business, per capita basis, getting a lot more loans than New York. So that's something we're concerned about, and we're glad there's a second phase of that stimulus. We hope we do better in the second phase.
Yeah. It was a first come, first served program, though. It had nothing to do with geography or anything.
Nothing to do with geography. It technically had to do with need, but clearly it wasn't proportionate to what the problem was. All businesses have had a fall off with revenues as a result of the COVID. So, because consumer spending is down 14-15%, so that's not a surprise. But but New York still did not do well in that process. Part of the problem is that so many, for example, of our small businesses, we've got close to 30,000 restaurants with 500,000 employees. For them, the terms of the PPP program, where you had to basically hire back all your employees and you're expected to be able to reopen on June 30th, by June 30th, that's not going to happen in New York. They'll be lucky to open by January 1st, many of them.
Wow, so that's scary.
That is, and so the programs that were put out quickly, which we give a lot of credit for, but we've got to make sure that in the next round of stimulus, New York City and the cities and states get some funding, both to deal with their expenses and the significant deficits they're facing out of this crisis, and also that we figure out some other solutions to the small business problem.
Andrew, have your tenants gotten any of these PPP loans? Are they paying their rents? How do you stand?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, while there have obviously been some hiccups with the program, if we didn't have that program, things would be a lot worse. And they're going to need to be additional rounds because, as Kathy pointed out, I've spent a lot of my time personally working with the small businesses, ranging from, sole proprietors to companies with 50, 75 employees, just to connect them to their banks, help them through the process, nudge it along. But if they're successful, and a significant number of them are starting to be successful, particularly in the second round, as Kathy said, that will hopefully get them over the next couple of months. But what happens after June 30th? And, it's particularly extreme with restaurants, but for a lot of these small businesses, they may come back July 1st and find out, only 25% of their revenues are still viable. So we are working closely with the tenants. It's in our DNA. It would be insane for a landlord not to, right?
Mhm.
Their success is going to be our success. So, if we can bridge them to the PPP, hopefully we see where they are by June 30, and hopefully there's going to be additional help. But
We're hearing that a lot from landlords, but a lot of people in government are saying we really can't trust landlords to do that. Therefore, we are going to suspend rent payments, or at least suspend evictions. There's a bill in the state Senate now that would suspend evictions for non-payment of rent for 6 months after the state of emergency ends, which basically takes us at least through the rest of the year. And I wondered, and by the way, there's also a bill in the city council that says you could walk away from your commercial lease, and and it would be unscathed.
I think,
right?
Eric, on your point about including the good news, or I guess Andrew made that point, that today the governor reiterated his position that the stay on eviction was the way he was going to approach both the residential and commercial rent issue. And I think as long, if it becomes politically acceptable just not to pay your rent, and it's a political decision, not a financial decision for a family that's really impacted by the crisis. Obviously, we're all going to be hurt by that, because that loss of non-payment of rent by those who can will result in a whole domino effect in terms of throughout the financial system. So we can't really have that. At the same time, we've got to figure out solutions that will last beyond June 30th. And I think that's what we're all thinking about now, is how do we do that? And how do we protect those people who really are in deep trouble?
Do you get the sense that the legislature, or the city council for that matter, understands how that would ripple through the financial system? I mean, there's a rent strike. There's a rent strike that it took effect today. AOC came out and said, she didn't denounce the rent strike. In fact, she said there's a rent strike because people can't pay rent. But actually, the rent strike is about people withholding their rent in order to create political pressure, correct?
Well, again, we have to come together as a city. There's no good guys, there's no bad guys. We've got to figure out how we as New Yorkers work together. When we had prosperous times, we could afford these kind of political battles. We can't now, and I think that certainly the governor has led the way on that. What he did yesterday, we're beginning to see some very strong statements. Yesterday, the governor and the mayor came together and said, we're going to shut down the subway from 1 a.m. till 5 a.m, and we're going to disinfect it, and we're going to make sure that it's a safe, healthy place for people to get back to work. That's kind of that and the contact tracing that they announced with Mayor Bloomberg, the testing and tracing. Mm-hmm. Those two factors are the single most important things to begin to restore a sense of security and confidence. And I think that's going to make a real difference.
Go ahead,
just
Alan.
To echo that.
Oh, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just to build on what Kathy said. I think in some ways for the last couple of decades, we've enjoyed enormous success generally in New York, but has not been shared by all. I think there is a recognition now more than ever that there's an interconnectedness between all of this. And, our lenders aren't giving us a holiday, and nor is government saying you don't have to pay any taxes anymore. So there's a connection between all of this with rent. And I also honestly find, like, our companies, they want to pay rent. And if they can't pay full rent this month, they want to get to it next month. Right? And so I just think, and I hope there will be a reprioritizing that says, it's maybe we can afford some of these fights at 3% unemployment when you're rapidly moving to double-digit unemployment. There's got to be a refocusing and a reprioritizing on what is going to preserve jobs and what's going to create jobs.
Yeah, I want to get back to that because I know you're in the middle of a rezoning issue. Alan, what happened if, you're probably best positioned to tell us this, like what would happen if there were a major fall off in rent collection, or for that matter, if there were rent strikes that targeted specific landlords as specific portfolios?
Well, I think you'd see foreclosures, and I think you'd see all of the damage that occurs in a foreclosure, which is to say economic destruction, You'd see a series of owners that would come in and I would say randomly act and you just can't, it's just chaos and it just doesn't work. I think if that's what we have to face, as Kathy said before, that we don't have the luxury of doing that. And we can't repeat that enough. This has to be really thoughtful stuff. And if you think about, the hotel workers union, or you think about, not-for-profits and cultural organizations, the challenges there are really deep and really complex. And we've all got to figure this out calmly, sort of apolitically, and well. Fast.
I think what are we at? 90% unemployment among hotel workers, I'm hearing. I mean, unemployment or occupancy rate in hotels in New York City is 33%, which is up from about 20% a couple of weeks ago. But that's a very deceiving number because most of the hotels are closed. So the occupancy rate doesn't even account for all of those that were closed. If we were to just look at the total environment of hotels, that existed, that were open 2 months ago, our occupancy is probably like 3%. There's just, that whole industry is just stopped on a dime. So
the last time that unions and business developers, corporate New York had to lock arm in arms was the fiscal crisis in the 70s, and Kathy and Alan played a role there. I was just riding the subways as a little kid and looking at the graffiti on the wall, but it's going to have to be the same thing this time. It's the hotel workers. It's 32BJ, the building workers. Look at what the transit workers have done during this. I mean, I talk about understanding interconnectivity of the city. Like, we don't function without the subway, and those unions have done an amazing job. We need to come together, business and labor, to figure this out.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were in the middle of a rezoning in Industry City. It's a $1 billion effort. Is that right? And all ULURPs, Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, which is the public review process that all rezonings go through, have been frozen. They've been suspended by the mayor because they involve public meetings, and you can't do public meetings unless they're virtual now. So I was wondering where that leaves you. It was a fight. So does that help or hurt? Does that give you more time? Maybe cool heads prevail. Maybe there's a new perspective on what you're proposing, or does this really set you back in terms of timing?
Well, look, we're waiting on city planning to restart the clock. We probably have 2 or 3 months left once that clock restarts. I would say things changed dramatically since we introduced this plan 5 years ago. Retail is very different than it was before. Last mile and things like that have exploded, and warehouse distribution is going to be more important than ever. So there are some things of value in the rezoning, and first and foremost, I would say, and I think this is a real model that we really sought at the Navy Yard and are trying to replicate at Industry City, which is embedding colleges and universities, particularly CUNY, in rapidly growing commercial centers and creating pathways for jobs for the future. That's the kind of development and equity that I think we need to look at in the future. So again, I can't look in the crystal ball and say, well, people's minds have changed once we restart, but I certainly hope that reprioritizing of what's important and the opportunity to take us from 7,000-8,000 jobs today to 20,000 jobs will become a lot more apparent in terms of the need than it was maybe 3 or 4 months ago.
It's funny because, all of us remember the days when we were just desperate for jobs and everything was about job creation, stop the loss of jobs, first stop it and then create new jobs. And then we moved into the point where we had such great job creation year after year that suddenly jobs became a bad thing for many people. For them, jobs meant people would come in and outbid them for their housing, drive up the cost of housing, push people out, gentrify neighborhoods, extend homelessness, and so somehow jobs became a bad thing. And that was like the fight Industry City was kind of in a microcosm of that, right? Because you were saying we're going to create these jobs, and there were some local opponents in Sunset Park saying, well, those are not the kind of jobs we want. So maybe you could, Kathy, maybe you could offer us some perspective on whether you think, that whole dynamic is going to change, and that debate about, development and whether it's bad, whether that will change now that, so many New Yorkers are not working at all.
Well, we have 1.6 million New Yorkers applying for unemployment insurance right now, and that's probably there's probably many more that can't get through the phone lines yet. So that certainly the job issue is going to come back, and we're going to have to handle it in a different way. There are a number of challenges. The housing affordability challenge has been with us for a number of years. Are we going to now try and figure out how to fix it? Because we've got a situation where we have people who are less able to afford than they were before. And how are we going to use this? Is there a silver lining in all this that we can figure out some more creative solutions to some of these chronic problems that have been with us? Obviously, the racial disparity in terms of the impact of the coronavirus on the Hispanic and Black communities is something that gives everybody a pause about what we've got to do with our healthcare system, and in terms of making sure that this is not repeated, and that it is made more equitable. So there's a bunch of harsh realities we're having to face right now, at the same time having the need to figure out how to reopen and get going. There's bigger issues. So this is something where it's going to take everybody, from the universities to business to labor to the community organizations. Everybody is going to have to take a new attitude, a more open attitude on this, and try and figure out how to solve the problem.
Yeah, and do you have any expectation, or either of you, any of you, that will actually happen, though, or will we just quickly revert? Alan?
It has to happen. We have to figure out how to make it happen.
We will.
It has to happen. And growth in New York City had already slowed. There were some numbers that showed it decreasing even before this. Like, New York succeeds when it grows. You can't be progressive without progress. And we've got to get back to that. And it's that there is an irony here, and there will be a tension in addition to the sort of normal resistance to density. There's the issue of COVID and density, right? But we have to figure out, particularly in the outer boroughs, how we create more density around job hubs, whether it's the Navy Yard or Industry City or Long Island City or the South Bronx. Mm-hmm. And part of that, as Kathy said, has to be an aggressive, affordable housing plan, unlike anything we've seen, to deal with some of the issues around equity and expense. And
well, the mayor thought he had an aggressive, affordable housing plan, but now he's just cutting billions of dollars from him because he doesn't have any funding at the moment. And he says, we'll make up for it, in the years 2023, 2024. By the way, when he'll be out of office. So, Alan, how do you see this? When I look at zoning maps of New York City, I'm sure you don't spend a lot of time looking at zoning maps of New York City, and neither do I. But when you do, you see quite a bit of it is low density zoning. I mean, aren't there tremendous opportunities out there to change the way the built city is?
Yeah, I think there are. I think the again, not to be too negative, when you sort of squint and close your eyes and think about what is a main street in an outer borough going to look like, or what is the main street in Harlem or East Village, and it's hard for me to see the model yet, and I'm not very creative, so I'm guilty. But we've got to come up with a model of retail that is real, not theoretical, and in the new world, medicine. And what is a medicine delivery system going to look like on the main street? Because all these questions have got to come together, and that's where universities and other thinkers have got to come and become part of this and leaders in this. And yes, it'll all come together, but it will have to be very different than what we've got today, because you're just not getting store after store after store opening up.
Yeah, in fact, they're all closing, or it seems that way anyway, except for the ones that are selling food. And even people are even getting used to ordering food online. So my question to the panel is, are the changes that we're seeing now through this stay-at-home era, how much are those going to last and potentially hurt New York?
So there's a very interesting example. Airbnb did a project basically providing housing for first responders around the country. And they have well over 250,000 hosts that have opened their houses for money and are allowing first responders to come into their homes for housing.
Right.
And so I think
they have
that's
no regular guests at the moment.
What's that?
They have no regular guests at the moment. So.
Well, sure, but still think about the decision of what that means. And it says something about the human spirit, but it also says something that people will get back to normal, quote unquote normal, perhaps more quickly than we think. That's what's keeping me excited, because I'm hoping that between the medicine and the vaccines and younger people and less threatened populations, you will get back to a more normal existence in a rationally time reasonable way.
Kathy, what do you see happening with the office market? I mean, all of your members have big offices in New York City. How are they talking about getting those offices restarted? Is there going to be a shift in the way they deploy people?
There is. It starts with employees. About a third of the employees in the city are people that can work from home. So we're not talking about the majority of the population, but we're talking about the professional workers, many of the big industries, the financial industry, et cetera.
Yes.
And they have adjusted to working from home. And there is a real split between employees, because employers are opinion surveying their workers. Mm-hmm. And they say it's very much split half and half between whether people are comfortable and want to stay working at home or whether they're eager to get back in the office. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to have to make a sales pitch for the city that we're safe, that they'll be healthy, that the protections are in place, and employers are going to have to make a pitch that they've got the proper regimen, the proper cleaning within the offices, that they've figured out what to do about not having too many people in an elevator. They're going to, so it's on both sides. That's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to be a campaign. So I would not expect office workers, for the most part, to be back before September. And when they are, they're going to need the real estate industry will be working with them. They're going to need more square footage. They're going to need different layouts. They're going to need different partitions. All of a sudden, the open office is not as popular as it had become over the last decade. So there are going to be a lot of design changes in office space, a different protocol. I've been looking at protocols from around the country, and I got one from Houston, where the business community was actually recommending, among other things, social distancing, et cetera, whistleblowers. Now, whoever thought they'd hear of that? But
that didn't work out too well for de Blasio, did it?
But it's to restore confidence among their employees, mm-hmm. that they'll be protected when they come back, and that the regimen is going to be safe for them.
Mm-hmm.
But think about the economic cycle of that. You have fewer people and more space, and the financial burden of that has got to get worked through a lot of complicated decisions.
Yeah, the key is there whether that results in people companies taking more space in New York,
no,
or looking for a cheaper location and moving half the jobs out.
That's the point.
Or leaving half the jobs at home. And that's a real challenge, because most firms I've talked to in terms of the industries, media, finance, tech, are finding they're very much have not lost their productivity once people adjusted to the remote workplace. The tools are such, like we are on right now, that they've been able to function. Even trading floors are functioning at basically 90% productivity from home.
I have a question from one of our viewers, Jack Rosenfield, and he asks whether social distancing, acceleration of the work from home trend will actually drive people from the city to the suburbs, which is something that was happening back in the days when we had high crime and the schools had a worse reputation. We saw that suburban flight. Are we going to see that now?
I'm not sure it's going to be a suburban flight as much as I think it's going to be a redistribution around the country. Yeah. I don't think it goes to the suburbs, but I think that it could well go to other cities.
Agreed.
And what about pandemic insurance and how landlords are going to write leases in the future? Because tenants are going to be looking for protection, and so are landlords for that matter, for something like this happening again, or maybe the same thing recurring, because we're probably going to see some resurgences, throughout this.
That goes back to your question about the federal government, because after 9/11, we couldn't get, office buildings couldn't get workers' compensation insurance. Now the federal government put in a program called terrorism risk insurance, where they provided for protection of an industry protection layer from the federal government. You're going to need the same thing now.
I would say that there's no misunderstanding of the seriousness of this at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. This is known to be for what it is. This is a deep threat to the U.S. economy, and I think it is well understood at the highest levels. So I think you'll see a lot of reaction. I think this is just very, very comprehensive and complex stuff.
And that's a bipartisan recognition. It's not.
Yeah, no, this is just too serious. And I refer you to Jay Powell's speech yesterday. He didn't make that speech because he's sanguine. That's for sure.
Right. Well, are any of you at this point? I mean, take off your political hats for the moment. Like, how can you really be optimistic when we don't really know if we can put 1,000, 2,000 people on a subway train, or we have 27,000 restaurants. We don't know when people are going to be able to dine, if it's a year and a half until there's a vaccine. I mean, now you can't dine with a mask on. So how is that going to work in New York City?
I think your point is right. I think we have confidence in our health, medical, research, life science system. They're going to find a vaccine. They're going to find cures. They're going to deal with that part of it. The hardest part of this is going to be the psychology of bringing people back, the whole social mix thing, getting people on the trains in a crowded environment. That's going to be tough. And that's the culture of New York. That's what makes New York's magic. We can't lose that social interaction piece. So it's going to be a matter of, one, getting the real solutions in terms of the health, medical, vaccines, cures, et cetera. And then number two, restoring confidence and figuring out how we can do that in a way that makes people feel they can be back in a social setting with comfort, whether it's in the workplace or in the theater or wherever.
And Andrew, you have some outdoor space there too, right? So you used to do a lot of outdoor events. Maybe those come back sooner than people walk into your stores. But have you thought about, how Industry City reopens?
Well, look, it hopefully is somewhat of an advantage that, you can access it more easily from the surrounding communities. We think there are going to be a lot more bikers, a lot more walkers coming to work. I think that's a good thing generally in the outer boroughs. The huge floor plates, I think, play well towards separating people. I think it's a real value proposition still. The wide staircases in terms of people going up and down as opposed to wanting to get in crowded elevators. But in the outdoor space will be a benefit. We're going to initially have to remove a lot of the tables and chairs. They already have been, and probably keep them removed for a period of time to keep people apart. But people are going to want the green space and the outdoor space that we have in between our buildings. So, again, as Kathy said, I hope this is a short period of time until we have treatments and are heading towards a vaccine or have a vaccine. Then there's the confidence level just of flooding the subways again. But I think it's going to come back because I really think people are going to want to be connected to each other again. All of the good feelings that we felt, banging pots and pans at 7 o'clock, like the federal government has been stepping up in some ways. It's got to be more. Like, I think all of that will lead towards New York City thriving again. It's just a question of how long is that period of time.
Let me ask you one more question because we only have 2 minutes left. And I want to get back to these budget deficits because they are unprecedented, really. We haven't seen these even in the Great Recession. We didn't see deficits of this size. And it doesn't look like the federal government is going to be sending the state or the city any money just to like fill those gaps. So Alan, do you think the city could end up in receivership or some kind of bankruptcy situation, or, you can't borrow enough money. You can't borrow really, you have to balance your budget. So are we just going to cut our way out of this?
I don't think that's going to be a cutting only. I think that the capital markets and the municipal markets will have a lot of tolerance for a lot of capacity, and they will work with the cities around the country, particularly a city like New York. So I think that New York has a lot of room to borrow it, and the state more so even has a lot of room to maneuver here. But I think that it has to be done, with reference to cutting on programs and so on and so forth. It's just got to be done all together, and it's got to be done, as Kathy said at the beginning.
So you're talking about going to the bond market. I
think the bond market would be very open to a lot of capacity.
And Eric, I disagree. I believe the federal government is going to come in for the states and the cities. They've made that pretty clear.
And I think the biggest problem there, Kathy, in my view, is that this problem is deeper and more pervasive in New York City, particularly, or New York, New Jersey.
That's the issue. That's the issue.
It's really very different when you leave New York City or the Northeast or however you want to characterize it.
Yeah.
It is very different.
Well, we know what happens in these situations. All the other states say, well, you're sending all this money to New York or California. What about us? And everyone demands an equal share of the pie.
The leader of the Senate's a New Yorker, and he knows how to maneuver pretty good.
Well, he's the minority leader.
The governor's platform on this issue, the number of people who are watching him across the country, I don't think you can minimize that. His ability to explain what the regional economy, New York City economy, New York State economy, what the regional economy does for the rest of the country, I think has been very powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The New York metro area is 10% of the national economy. So if you take that out, that's a huge blow. So, and the governor's made the point, of course, in regular years, we give tens of billions of dollars more to Washington than we get back. So it's only right that every so often, we get something. I want to thank all of our guests, Alan Fishman from Ladder Capital, Andrew Kimball from Industry City, and Kathy Wylde from the Partnership for New York City. A reminder to all of our viewers, please go to therealdeal.com to subscribe. And on the topic of rent strikes and canceling rent, come back on Monday at 5 o'clock. We're going to have State Senator Julia Salazar and a representative from the real estate industry talking about how, debating, if you will, how that is going to play out. So please come back 5 o'clock. Thank you, everyone else, for watching, and tune in next time.